Welcome, I'm Emily Keogh, women's football writer, and I'm joined by Tom Hamilton, senior writer in the studio in London, and Jeff Kassouf in the US, the NWSL lead and US women's national team writer. How are you both?
Good here, yeah. Looking forward to a little bit of spring breaking through finally, and what's going to be an incredible end to the season. But what about you? Haven't seen you since in Spain?
No, very good, very busy. It's kind of that starting the back end of the season, so busy, everything starting, and obviously Jeff, yourself, the NW season's starting very soon, so I can imagine it's all a go.
Yeah, looking forward to spring as well, like Tom said. And yeah, I mean, days away from the regular season. We got our little taste of it with the Challenge Cup over the weekend. So I do feel like I was just in Kansas City for the final. Honestly, this is the days of very long off seasons here are gone, but I guess maybe for the better. I guess we'll touch on that topic. But
yeah, definitely. Obviously, I think, should we start with a bit of WSL, bit of Chelsea chat?
Absolutely.
Obviously, the big topic at the minute is Chelsea are undefeated in every tournament. And obviously with the new coach, Sonia Bompastor, they're looking at a potential 6th consecutive WSL season. They're also in the running for a quadruple, which is, we've kind of say it every season with Chelsea and then they drop off. But this season seems like the season they could go on to win it.
Yeah, I mean, they've been unreal. And you can see that they haven't really skipped a beat since Emma Hayes left. If anything, they've got better. Which is just an astonishing example of long-term planning, of succession planning, and also the quality of coaching and players there. So this is a team that knows how to win. It's very much in their DNA, and they've just been absolutely unrelenting in this. And we're seeing it now across all 4 competitions. But coming up, and I know we'll talk about this, are this quadruple of key matches with Man City. And that's surely going to be what's going to define their season.
Yeah, we talk a lot about squad depth for Chelsea, and obviously in January, strengthened even more with Kira Walsh and Naomi Girma. And I guess, Jeff, one for you is, what can Chelsea expect from Girma? Because obviously she had a debut the other week, but it was a bit short-lived. She picked up an injury and has came off. But in the long run, what are they going to get out of Girma?
yeah, I think clearly a long-term play, right? And I think disappointing to see how it started. And it sounds like it's not too serious, which is a good thing for everybody, obviously. But, I mean, look, I don't think it's out of the question despite her age, and maybe you'd say relative inexperience for the position. I think that's even a strange term to use for her because she was so good right out of the gate out of college a few years ago. But one of the best defenders in the world, center back, specifically defenders at large, just her ability to defend 1v1, to read the game, I think very much reminds me as somebody who covered most, if not all of Becky Sauerbrun's career, of that cerebral center back that, maybe is not as flashy because she's always in the right position anyway before that play develops. So she doesn't have to make a spectacular play because she's read the play. So I think, really a spectacular defender. And I think probably an underrated part of her game is a defender who sets play. And maybe the U.S. saw a little bit of that missing in the She Believes Cup as a defender who can handle some pressure, play out of the back, find her midfielders, find a ball over the top if she needs to. So really well-rounded, really intelligent defender. And I think, somebody who is really only getting started in her career despite being around for a few years already. So I think really a long-term investment for Chelsea and, a player who could be the best defender in the world for some time, really.
Jeff, I'm keen to know this move back in January. What sort of effect did it have on the NWSL as a whole? A team from the WSL coming in, paying a huge amount of money, a record transfer for one of the brightest stars in US football at the moment, US soccer. I mean, is it something where teams are now thinking we're gonna have to match the spending power? Is it something where they're saying we can't match the spending power? And what are the sort of long-term effects of the Girma deal?
Yeah, I think it's the semi-annual debate here in the U.S., right? I mean, the 2023 World Cup being as poor as it was for the U.S. ignited it again of what is the future of specifically U.S. players and star players in the NWSL. And we actually didn't see what I think many expected, myself maybe included, of a larger exit from the NWSL following that World Cup. So I do think we still see these on an individual basis, right? And I would add that as many of our listeners are probably aware, the situation in San Diego is and was particularly unique for the 2024 that they had, which was largely disastrous on and off the field. This was a transfer in general terms. I think Chelsea was really at, if not near, if not at the top of the list for Girma for a while, but a transfer in general that was requested in terms of moving on from San Diego earlier in 2024. The same for Jaden Shaw, who's not at the Gurma level of star power, perhaps, but similarly a bright young talent, a top player, and she obviously moved internally within the league. So, I think the knee jerk thing is always in these cases to say, is the NWSL in trouble? Can they compete with Europe? I think that's a conversation that's never going to go away because we're always talking about, or perhaps things could change more drastically elsewhere. But we're typically always talking about a hard salary cap league up against typically places that don't have at least hard salary caps, right? Maybe a soft cap. So there's always an artificial ceiling in the NWSL that's been created for a reason to create parity. So, I think long term, I'm not sure that this has a major effect because the NWSL has at least attempted to plan for this. The cap goes up every year. There's a CBA for the next 6 years, 5 years. The cap is rising. There's accounting for that growth. But I think the thing that'll be difficult for teams is, has the NWSL calibrated that the right way? The steady growth of the cap and accounting for this global competition. If they haven't gotten that right and this grows even faster than it has been, then teams could feel a little bit hamstrung and the league will have to adjust with some sort of new concocted mechanism like an allocation money that's going away to help teams go out and spend more when they need to.
Yeah, I'm sure I would touch a bit more on the NWSL in a minute, but I'm curious, you mentioned there that Chelsea was really high up on Guyman's list when she was looking for a move in the January window. And I guess one to both of you is, how much do you think Chelsea being unbeaten and the fact that they are still on course for a quadruple this season potentially impacted her decision? Because we know there were several other clubs that were quite keen to sign her, but do you think that Chelsea's, I guess, the start that they had to this season was a factor in her decision?
Yeah, I can jump in, Tom. I mean, I think perhaps, I do think, again, to like the personal side of things, we heard this with Emily Fox as well when she went to Arsenal. I do think that there's a personal element to it. Just a lifestyle, I guess, is maybe the better word for some of these US players who haven't experienced a club abroad and maybe have the pick of a few top clubs, right? I mean, if you have Chelsea, Lyon, and Arsenal calling, there's not necessarily a bad choice there. Maybe some look better than other and some fit better than other. But I think that there is an element of being in London as well, of the experience, the life that can be lived and something that's, I mean, personally living in Connecticut, I take San Diego too. But, in terms of experiencing that, I think, that was part of it as well, to be at a top club, but also to be somewhere that was an appeal from a personal perspective as well. So I think it could have been a factor, yeah, but I think one of many.
I wonder, with this deal now, though, and the way that Chelsea have been this season, do you think we're almost getting into a stage where we've almost got like a 4-tier league, where you've got Chelsea, who are ahead of everyone else, then you've got City, Arsenal, and you've got Man United, then the rest, and then the teams right at the bottom? Do you fear that that Chelsea are kind of taking this to another level? Their spending power, their strength and depth, also Kira Walsh, one of the world's best defensive midfielders, the ability to pay these wages as well, coupled with the brilliant coaching. Are they now almost out in a league of their own?
I think potentially yes, but I don't think it's all just because Chelsea have been so good and that so much has gone well for them, because obviously Arsenal were putting in world record bids for Russo, for Earps, were in the running for Gurma. So I think they are out-muscling clubs, but I don't think it's fair to say that other clubs can't spend the same. But I think Chelsea are probably more willing, and at this time potentially foregoing a little bit of the business model and the strategy stuff to think, if we don't do it now, when are we going to do it? And I think, there's a lot of talk about caps in the WSL at the minute and kind of where the future of the WSL is going. And I don't necessarily think spending caps are the right place right now, unless they're quite high. I think it's more, how do we get other clubs to invest? How do we support other teams to spend more so that we have a bit more of an even playing field? But I do think a lot of it is, Chelsea's depth, it is incredible. And that has been built up from not just this season. We're going back years of Emma Hayes, of, like you said, the succession planning, looking at young players, bringing in younger players, sending them out on loan, and really looking at future plans. I don't think other clubs have really grasped yet. I was reading something that Tom Gary put on X quite recently about how, Arsenal have been former winners of everything in the past, but in the past 10 years have only won the league once, and it's been 10 years since they won the FA Cup. And what's not changed at Arsenal, I think, is the question, not so much of what are other clubs doing, but what isn't changing at the clubs that aren't developing anymore. So I think it's almost like a two-pronged approach to looking at that, in terms of like, what are Chelsea doing so well and what is allowing them to spend so much money, but then what are other clubs not doing?
And I think we're coming up to a pivotal time in the season. They've got these the 4 matches against Man City. I know this is something you've been looking into. What sort of a challenge does it pose a team when they are playing the same team in the space of, was it 12 days?
Yeah, it's quite. It almost could have been a 5th match if the FA Cup ties had been differently. But yeah, it's going to be really tough for both teams. And I was down at Chelsea last week and I had a chat to Lucy Bronze, and she kind of described it as a chess match. She said, you're going to learn things from each game, and each game's going to be different. Neither team are going to put out the same starting 11 each game. Sorry, they're not going to be able to, with it being 3 games in between. And each one has a different motivation, a different outcome. Obviously, the first one, you've got a trophy on the line. And I know, Chelsea have said all season, it's great we're unbeaten, we've not won anything yet. So that's the first trophy. And I think for Man City, it's potentially one of the only trophies they may get this season. They're out the running for WSL, got really tough Champions League ties. So that makes it really interesting. And then you've got the 2 Champions League games, which neither of them are going to want to lose. But you almost have, it's half time essentially after the first one. They've got the second one, they've got the league in the middle. So it is such an interesting thing. And the way, I guess, the games are scheduled is quite interesting, that you've got the League Cup final first, and then it goes into Champions League, then the league, then Champions League. So it almost is like 4 very, very different games, but they are going to look and feel very similar. They're all also at 4 different grounds. So there are things that are going to separate them, but it is the same opponent. And I kind of said to Lucy, is it a bit like Groundhog Day? You're doing the same prep for the same team. And then she kind of said, but it's not going to be the same team, because we're not going to put out the same team. City aren't going to put out the same team. The tactics aren't going to be the same. So it is really interesting, and yeah, we are doing a piece on kind of that, and chatting to some people that have played in 4 or 5 consecutive games in the past against the same opponent. But I think it is a big crunch time for both teams. Obviously, Chelsea want to win something to kind of solidify that unbeatenness, and City have a point to prove. It's been a bit of a rough season, so it's interesting from both sides, and I think it's the first time potentially domestically in England that we've had 4 games in such a short space of time against the same opponent. So I'm interested to also see kind of the fan response to that. Do the fans stay and travel for each of the games, or does it get a bit too repetitive that they kind of drop off at the end of it?
And if they manage to get through that City quarter final, then it's likely to be Barcelona, who 3 of the last 4 seasons in the Champions League have brought their campaigns to an end. They've been their bête noire. Do you think that Chelsea, under Sonia now, and also with her experience of having won the Champions League, do you think they're in the best place possible now, and perhaps reflecting on the relative strength of Barcelona, to finally bring this run to an end and finally win that elusive crown?
Yeah, they say 3rd time's a charm, isn't it? And obviously it'll be the 3rd time we have that semi-final in the past 3 seasons. And I think, we were saying before we came on air that I don't actually think Chelsea lost either of those semi-finals because they were poor. I think the first one, tactically, they just didn't set up right. Hayes played that first tie to minimise the damage, to try and have something to play for at the new camp, and it didn't really work. And then obviously last season, won that first leg, and then the second leg had that red card against Khadijah Buchanan, which Hayes famously said it was the worst decision in UEFA Champions League women's history. So I actually think that those matchups are really close, and actually potentially Chelsea were the better side in a couple of those games. So I do think this is the best chance they are going to have at beating Barcelona. I think we've seen they probably aren't the same Barcelona they are after Geraldez left for Washington Spirit. I think we've seen a slight struggle in them. Obviously, they've lost a key number of players. Obviously, Walsh now going to Chelsea. It is a really interesting time for both clubs, but I do think that if Chelsea are going to get past that semi-final, it will be this season. And I think given Sonia knows what it takes to win as a player, as a manager, I think I would bet my money on Chelsea this season getting past Barcelona in that semi-final.
And are they going to finish the season unbeaten?
I don't think they'll finish unbeaten. I think they will drop points, and I think it will kind of come in the league, or, they'll be doing the Champions League semi-finals, they'll be in the end stage of the FA Cup, potentially the final. And I think it will come in one of those games like we've seen with the Leicester and Brighton, with the teams that you don't expect them to knock points off of, but maybe tactics are right, players are tired, they're rotating a lot more, something just doesn't go right. I would be really, really shocked if they did end the season unbeaten. I think it's possible, but I think they may drop and may lose a game here and potentially just one, but I think it will come in the league, and it'll be when the fatigue sets in. They're right at the end of the season, and I think they'll just struggle at one game.
I think City are going to beat them in the league, so that's my prediction.
Okay,
I'm going for it. And as you said, the players are exhausted, so the last thing they need is another tournament, which is exactly what FIFA have done. So more on that later. But now I think we're going to head over to Connecticut for a bit of NWSL. The NWSL returns, and with ESPN's coverage on the opening weekend is for Kansas City Currents versus Portland Thorns, 12:45 p.m. on Saturday on ABC, ESPN Plus, and in Spanish on ESPN Deportes. Now, Jeff, I know that you've been looking forward to this, previewing it extensively for ESPN FC. You've done your ambition rankings. Could you just talk us through exactly how you've put these together and who's going to be the most annoyed?
Well, my answer is usually everybody, but maybe everybody except the top few. But it's an idea of, I mean, look, this is a league that I think has been near the forefront of the business boom of women's sports, of women's soccer. We've seen it with the record valuations of clubs. And this is our second year doing them, of trying to quantify that, of who exactly is setting the bar, who is sort of middling in the middle, who is maybe trying to keep up or not doing so. So this is a league that wants to be, in many ways, I think explicitly, implicitly, an NFL in some ways. They've hired plenty of executives to the front office for it, and it wants to be big time. So who's setting that bar, who's doing that, and how are they doing that? So we've tried to break those down into categories of, okay, well, what does that look like? It is stated intention of how they would grow. It is investing money into facilities, which seems to be constantly one of the biggest things, one of the biggest talking points of infrastructure and most expensive points too. How creative are they? Are they investing in staff? Because that's historically a problem in this league and maybe globally for women's soccer, of just proper staffing to do the things you need to do. So really trying to break that down into categories as best we can. This year I did reach out to clubs and tell me what I don't know about what you're doing, because we see, obviously I think we all get the press releases about these great things, but there's more to club operations than the things we know about. So Kansas City at the top in those rankings. Kansas City and Angel City, frankly, are the two clubs operating in at least language that's a B for billions. Angel City wants to be the first $1 billion club in the world. Kansas City is undergoing $1 billion waterfront restoration of the entire Kansas City downtown area on the waterfront. So they're really in a league of their own. And then I'll leave some intrigue for the rankings themselves beyond that, but really quite a wide range of who's doing what and how are they doing that, and helps us sort of see who needs to step it up, really.
I was just going to ask, what was the most surprising thing that came back from one of the franchises which you didn't know when you were trying to ask them to sell themselves? Was there anything there which you thought, well, this is new?
I think that I got a lot of different things. Candidly, not every specific detail made it to print, because I really was tasked with, as we can all probably empathize with, bringing down the word count a bit and maybe generalizing some things. Yeah. But, teams shared, Angel City, for example, shared some interesting stuff that I couldn't really, in the space that I had, bring into, what they have, but they have, certain player amenities, like forgetting the exact terminology. It's basically like a float tank, a sensory deprivation tank, as an example of certainly a thing that is not high on the list of things I probably would have researched, but I did look it up, and I guess it might cost something like $20,000. So, that's an interesting type of thing to have. I believe they said they're the only ones in the league with it. So, stuff like that I think is surprising. And then, I will say there is news within this story. So I'll pitch people to go read it, especially on the Kansas City front. There are things that they are doing that are previously unannounced that are in this story. So that was news to myself as well.
That sounds very exciting, and we won't spoil too much. We'll let people read it. I'm really curious a little bit, Jeff, about Angel City, because I know we briefly had a chat before about kind of their managerial front, because obviously Mark Parsons came out and said that they're not going to look to hire a manager straight away. The candidates they're looking at are available in June. How much, I guess, of their patience to wait for a manager kind of then feeds into that ambition element, that they're not rushing to find someone straight away, and that they're prepared to play the long game a little bit?
Yeah, well, look, I'm not saying anything new here. I think they know this within their walls, that the weakest point of the entire franchise to date in the few years it's been around has been the on-field product. The off-field product has been, building a global brand. I think that they have an argument as the most recognizable global women's soccer franchise. I mean, obviously there are teams, we just spoke about them in the first segment, that are attached to men's teams that are bigger brands at large. But in terms of Angel City's play from the beginning to be more than a soccer team, to be a brand that people recognize and stands for something, I think, all of those creative things put them right near the top of ambition. But obviously you need to win games as well. And that is something that has really eluded the franchise in these years. I mean, they made the playoffs, but other than that, it's been really up and down. So, bringing in Mark Parsons as sporting director, I think is a good step in terms of certainly somebody who has won in this league, frankly, and who knows how to win in this league. So, that's step one, I think, for them. And then obviously whatever this hire is going to be, which I think we can rightfully conclude is somebody currently coaching in Europe based on these timelines, even though Mark Parsons did not want to confirm the exact specifics of the finalists. This hire is going to be really important because LA is a town, like, you could say this about anybody, but LA is a place where, the interest can fade pretty quickly if you can't put a good product on the field. And Angel City has been able to always put out a meaningful brand, even when they've struggled on the field. But at some point, I think that the Lakers could attest to this. Many teams could attest to this. If you keep struggling on the field, on the court, and you can't give them that product, interest can fade. And Angel City, being what they are, they cannot operate in a stadium that looks a little more empty than it was, right? So they're really going to need to get this right for the long term. And that is going to be a big piece for them is this managerial hire. And honestly, the pieces that come together on the roster from it.
Looking across the league, key storylines. Who have you got down as favourites for the overall title? But equally, what should we be keeping an eye on over the next few weekends?
Yeah, well, I think, you all were just talking about it in the WSL, right? I mean, how many tiers of teams are there? This is a league that has traditionally been built on parity and competition. And 2 years ago, we saw the most competitive season we'd ever seen. I mean, a season that came down to the final weekend where just about everything was in play for playoff positioning, for the league title, or for the Shield, that is. And then last year, we saw the polar opposite. We saw a top four that ran away from the rest of the group, North Carolina on an island by itself, and then everybody else. And that everybody else had some separation as well within it. But, we look at that top four and I look at that, and we just saw Washington and Orlando in the Challenge Cup this past weekend. And the top four, largely unchanged when you look at their core group. If anything, they've added pieces to get better. So I think for me, you look at this season and we need to see in the totality of it, is this going to be another season where there's a clear top four that runs away with this? And is this perhaps a new reality, at least in the short term, of the NWSL? Because if it is, that would stand in stark contrast to the entire ethos of this league and everything that's been built with salary caps and parity and everything else. So yeah, that top four, you look at Orlando, Washington, Gotham, and Kansas City, and they're all teams that I think have largely gotten better. They haven't lost their stars. North Carolina, I think the move for Jaden Shaw shows some ambition to want to try to join that group and maybe make it a top five. But I think, this is a league that typically has a surprise or two, but it's going to be really difficult for anybody outside of that five, I would say, to really crack into it in the long run. We'll see some results early in the season, no doubt, but in the long run, I think that this could be interesting to see. Is this truly still a league where on any given day anybody could win, or is this a league where we now see some clubs that have really pulled away? And that'll be interesting to see on the field and then off the field, because I think if that becomes the case and people start worrying about that, I think that'll make its way to the boardroom, and maybe they'll have some more checks and balances that they want to implement.
I'm quite curious, Jeff, because obviously the NWSL breaks are kind of halfway through the season for the Euros and the AFCON, and obviously that's kind of the end of the European League. How much impact does that make on the NWSL when they have to break they kind of had the first part of the season, then they have this gap away, and then they come back?
Yeah, I think we're still learning. I mean, I do think this is the new reality, though, because you look at to the point of, major tournaments really nonstop. I mean, even in the US here, that extends to the Men's World Cup next year, because the reality that the NWSL has not really discussed very explicitly is that they really can't play through that either. They have venues that won't be available. They have teams like Kansas City building these incredible facilities that plan to be host sites for teams, for training sites. So this is really the new reality for the U.S. It's been part of the calendar conversation. Should it be flipped anyway? Because the summer is always going to be a problem. So I do think that business-wise, there's an effect. And this year, instead of the Liga MX tournament that we saw last year that unfortunately fell flat, I think a good idea that fell flat, teams are tasked with sort of scheduling their own friendlies and, making some big events that they can hopefully make some money off of. But this is going to be a new reality on the business front. And then, on the sporting front, I think it's still a little bit to be determined. I mean, we saw teams last year, Bay FC, a good example, that was an expansion team, maybe a unique circumstance, but really had a poor start to the season, rebuilt themselves over the summer. You could say the same thing about the other expansion team, Utah, and then came back in the back half of the season with a retooled roster, made some summer moves, and looked totally different. Bay FC made the playoffs. Utah was weirdly probably one of the best teams in the back half of the season, despite being, so low in the table. So I do think it divides the season in a way that makes it very almost separated. I mean, even a Kansas City came back with a new team, even though in the back half of the season, even though they were a top squad in the season. So I think it has an odd sporting effect where, in Europe, maybe you've got that break that's a few weeks, depends on the league, obviously, but this is really quite extensive, but it's here to stay. Women's World Cup, Men's World Cup, Confederation tournaments. I mean, this is the new reality for the NWSL.
Before I go and find one of Angel City's flotation chambers, just a word on Sophia Wilson and her news.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, obviously, congratulations. I think incredible news, obviously, for her in expecting her first child. And then, the Thorns. I mean, I think notably, we've not talked about the Thorns here, obviously, as of yet. We've talked about a big four, perhaps, that doesn't include the Thorns, who are arguably the most storied franchise in the league to date. And, I think we'll have, we'll see them on opening day, on opening weekend here on our network against the Kansas City again. And this is, a team that has taken a lot of hits on the field. And this obviously for good reason. So a totally different reason. But, it's a team that had just announced 3 season-ending injuries, all related to knee injuries. So, one of those being Morgan Weaver, who is a top forward in herself, would be somebody you would turn to if you don't have Sophia Wilson available for an extended period of time. The Thorns just had Becky Sauerbrunn and Christine Sinclair retire. The on-field plus leadership elements there that disappear. So I think more than ever, I mean, we've talked about this certainly last year, maybe the year before to a degree. The Thorns, they've got some question marks heading into this season for sure. And they found themselves outside of that top 4. They found themselves now chasing that in a league that could be trying to pull away that elite group anyway. And, I think that there are fans in Portland have shown some worry. And I think that they're right to have some worry about where things stand exactly on the field. But yeah, again, obviously, spectacular news for Sophia Wilson. And, I think, she'll be excited for the months ahead.
So as Jeff said there, squads are stretched, players are injured, players are already at burnout. So good news, there's a new tournament coming, so more matches for them. FIFA have decided to bring in 2 new competitions, and more on that in a second.
To finish, we need to talk about the announcements made by FIFA last week that there's going to be a FIFA Champions Cup early next year between the winners of the respective Champions Leagues around the confederations and the start of a 16-team Women's Club World Cup from 2028. Now, obviously, we've touched a little bit about burnout and loading and obviously the concerns around the schedule that have been there for seasons already. I mean, your thoughts on two more tournaments?
Was where do you fit it in, basically? I mean, every single time we talk to Serena Wigman, she mentions the calendar. You talk to the players, they mention the calendar. It's already absolutely jam-packed, and players seldom have a summer off. If they do, it's probably because they're injured. So look, you can see what they're trying to do. They're trying to bring together some sort of global competition. They're trying to take it to sort of new markets, etc., etc. But equally, fundamentally, I think it's forgetting the players, and that always seems to be the case. The players seem to be the last ones thought of in this instance. And we've already got issues across both the men's and women's game with burnouts. It's a topic which is talked about every single week, whether it's a player falling out of form, a spate of injuries. Obviously, the women's game with the ACL injuries as well, which is so prevalent. So look, you can see the ambition, and I think that should be encouraged, but equally, there are so many questions about this and few answers. And I think you can't stretch beyond 365 days, and they're somehow trying to do that.
I think also you look at the comments that I know in the league, especially the past couple of weeks, there's been a lot of talk around whether we're going to have expansion and relegation scraps potentially. I know that Nikki Doucette and the WPLL are looking at all range of options, but essentially have said nothing is off the table in terms of foregoing relegation for a few seasons to allow expansion, which is anywhere from 2 to potentially 8 extra games a season, plus these new tournaments. It's, everything's just getting squeezed, and no one is, like you say, thinking about the players in this. The good thing with women's football, especially here, is that you have the winter break. You usually have 2 to 3 weeks off. Do we see a point where that goes out the window? And obviously players are screaming out for more rest, and it just seems a little bit of an interesting time to say that. Obviously we were 10 months out from the Club World Cup, was meant to be at the start of next year, so I think everyone kind of assumed it wasn't going to go ahead when we didn't have a qualifying format or a host or anything, and it was meant to be 10 months away. So I do think there's a slight lack of planning, I guess, potentially, that this might have been a slightly rushed decision, but that's just my opinion on it. I guess, Jeff, for you guys over in the US, how was the announcement taken?
Yeah, Tom, maybe FIFA's leaning into the leap year too. That you said 365. You get the extra day, I guess, there, right? That'll be the spin on it. I think like this is. I mean, calendar is a huge topic over here, right? I mean, in reporting just about anything and everything about the league, Emily. I mean, like it's everything relates back to the calendar. That's what several executives told me last year when we were doing the GM survey, the anonymous GM survey. You talk about roster sizes, you talk about salary cap, you talk about business items. It's all about the calendar, and then obviously the player burnout. So, I think that there are equal questions and concerns about it, and it hits in a different way here in that. We know that in this first quadrennial cycle, everything's set for the end of January for these confederation or what are they calling them? The Champions Cup, and then the actual proper Club World Cup in 2028. That is the very, very first days of preseason here for NWSL clubs. If they are to be Liga MX clubs, that's sort of mid-season or mid changeover from their split season. So, I think that'll be an interesting topic and debate as ever of, European clubs, among some others, will come in mid-season, maybe sacrificing a mid-season break. NWSL clubs will come in preseason form, or Liga MX clubs will be in a different space as well. So, I think that the player burnout remains a huge topic. FIFA's obviously found January as what they feel to be a sweet spot. I mean, they can't put it in the summer, right? Because we know of the other continental championships, the World Cup, obviously the Olympics. So, I think it's been met with some caution. I think there's like the concept of a Club World Cup sounds amazing. I think we all like the idea of finally, even though, we've seen it in sort of exhibition type of form, putting a Lyon up against an Orlando or whoever might be, representing there. But, the questions of the calendar, the prize money, the location, the travel, I think there's a lot of things to be figured out, and how are they going to be answered? I think there's a general skepticism about it.
Yeah, completely. I think the Champions Cup is something that interests me quite a bit, because obviously the Champions League has been an established thing in Europe, but not really anywhere else. And obviously they're introducing these Champions League style formats to be able to have a Champions Cup. And I'm just really interested about kind of the funding and sort of potentially some of the areas that we haven't talked about in these tournaments is kind of, are they being supported financially? How are clubs getting around things like travel, and where are these extra games going to be put in the calendar as well, if they've got to do some qualifying elements to it?
And also you're looking at the appeal of these tournaments, because if you have a star player playing for one of the African teams, inevitably they're going to get picked up by the bigger fish. And so you need this sort of star power to carry these tournaments. And you're absolutely spot on. There's still questions around funding. Again, you can see what they're trying to do. They're trying to ensure that with a high tide, all boats rise, but it's still an issue. And as I said at the start, there's still so many questions. And I think what's going to happen is we're going to see how the first couple go, and we're going to see the rest of it grow in the process. But still, it does feel like this has been an announcement made before sort of it's ready to be made, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah. Do you think, I guess to both of you, obviously we're talking then about kind of you squeeze it in at different points and different clubs are in different sessions with pre-season, different phases of the league. I guess obviously from NWSL perspective, do you think then that clubs may be forced to introduce pre-season earlier so that break gets reduced? And I guess same thing here, like you were talking about then the mid-season breaks get reduced. Do you think it may then force these kind of not mandatory breaks that we're getting, but these current quite natural breaks that we get for a couple of weeks? Do you think that they're going to go out the window a little bit?
Well, I could speak to over here. I mean, I think there's added layers because the collective bargaining agreement mandates certain preseason start dates. It mandates a mid-season break for players where they cannot be asked, nothing can be asked of them. And that is in addition to, like, if you look even at this summer that's coming, there's a mandated CBA break and then the league break, just to sort of technically separate those things. So, it's just to say the level of layers within these decisions, even the legalities, are quite numerous. From a CBA perspective, I mean, you mentioned expansion. That is not going away here. We're at 14 teams. We've got 16 coming for next year. Jessica Berman, as commissioner, has gone on record recently to say that she sees no reason why this can't be a 30-team league. I have my own many thoughts on that, but if we're looking that far into the future, a 30-team league, I mean, what does that look like for a schedule, right? So I think that there's a lot of layers that will require, it'll be action reaction for quite a while. I could see this going the way of this Champions Cup is a nice little thing to try. It goes away after a Club World Cup gets established, and then it's only something to worry about every 4 years, maybe.
That's all for this week. We'll be back to talk women's football again soon. Mark, James and Rob are back next week as Thomas Tuchel gets ready to take on his first game as England manager.